It is indeed my pleasure to be able to stand before you this afternoon and to bring to you a lesson from God's Word. I appreciate the honor of being able to speak at the comatose hour. Hope to be able to maybe to revive some of you. Maybe we should have sung "Revive Us Again" before I got up here. This is it's hard. Some people say that lesson right after that session right after we eat's the hardest one. No, you're still on your sugar high from your desserts. And at this hour you're crashing. And so as I told someone, this is the hour that you put a speaker that is going to be someone that will keep everybody awake, keep their attention, or he's someone that nobody cares what he's going to say anyway. So I'll let you decide when it's over which one that is. Many of you I know from you coming and visiting at Branson during the year and even coming for our lectureship. It's good to see you. We appreciate so much that you love coming to our Super Walmart better than your Super Walmart, because that's what most people do when they come to Branson is shop at our Walmart. I don't know what it is, but thank you for those tax dollars. You keep them coming. I'd like to invite you to come to make plans. The last week of May is when we have our lectureship, Lord willing. It'll be, since there's 5 Sundays in May this coming year, it'll be the 4th Sunday through the 5th Sunday of May, and that's May 24th through the 31st. And we've already got, we're not through lining up our speakers, but we've got about 20-something already scheduled to come, and we're excited. We went from year 1 to year 2, had an increase of 25% in attendance. From year 2 to year 3, I'm not sure, but it's somewhere between 15 and 20% more that we grew in attendance, with 16 different states represented and 65 different congregations represented. So, we've really been blessed. Brother John spoke about the fact that you want to go to heaven, you want to go to Branson. Well, some people, when they visit Branson, they feel like they've died and gone to heaven there, Brother John. But you haven't, but it is a taste of it if you'll come and worship with us there. 3 times in the New Testament, we read about how God, the Father, spoke from heaven to and about His Son, Jesus, and did so in a public way. The first time we find it in Matthew chapter 3, Jesus has just been baptized by John the Baptist, and when he came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Holy Spirit descended upon Jesus in the form of a dove. And we have a voice from heaven that proclaims, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." What we have here is, for everybody that's there, this is a miraculous way to start the Lord's ministry. It's an announcement to them. Listen to Him. Then we have another time in which Jesus is spoken to and about. And we're going to be spending most of our time dealing with that today. And that's on the Mount of Transfiguration. But then there's a third time in John chapter 12, verse 28, where Jesus says, "Father, glorify thy name." And there came therefore a voice out of heaven saying, "I have both glorified it and will glorify it again." So the third time, when Jesus says, "I want to glorify your name," the Father says, "That's exactly what you've done. And that's what you'll continue to do when you complete your mission. You will glorify me again." Well, the second time on the Mount of Transfiguration is we find that in Matthew chapter 17, verse 5, where when Jesus begins to glow and he's standing there in the presence of Moses and Elijah. And we'll read the text here in just a moment, but the voice from God says at this point, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him." Now this particular incident is recorded in 3 different Gospels. Matthew records it, Mark records it, and Luke records it. And I want to read each of these in full, just because of the fact that during this lesson we're going to be taking different parts, because each of them, while they are talking about the same incident, we learn different things because of what one may add where another doesn't include that. So, let's begin with Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 13. And after 6 days, Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John his brother, and bringeth them up into an high mountain apart, and was transfigured before them. And his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. And behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elias talking with him. Then answered Peter and said unto Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If thou wilt, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, one for Elias. While he yet spoke, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice out of the cloud which said, This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear ye him. And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their face and were sore afraid. And Jesus came and touched them and said, Arise, and be not afraid. And when they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no man save Jesus only. And as they came down from the mountain, Jesus charged them, saying, Tell the vision to no man until the Son of Man may be risen again from the dead. And his disciples asked him, saying, Why then shall the scribes that Elias must first come? And Jesus answered and said to them, Elias truly shall first come and restore all things. But I say unto you that Elias is come already, and they knew him not. But have done unto him whatsoever they listed, likewise shall also the Son of Man suffer of them. Then the disciples understood that he spoke unto them of John the Baptist. And then Mark, in his record, beginning in verse 2 of chapter 9, going through verse 10. And after 6 days, Jesus taketh with him Peter and James and John, and leadeth them up into a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow, so as no fuller on earth can whiter them. And there appeared unto them Elias with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, and one for Elias. For he wist not what to say, for they were sore afraid. And there was a cloud that overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, saying, This is my beloved Son, hear him. And suddenly when they had looked around about, they saw no man any more, save Jesus only with themselves. And as they came down from the mountain, he charged them that they should tell no man what things they had seen, till the Son of Man were risen from the dead. And they kept that saying with themselves, questioning one with another what the rising from the dead should mean. And then last we have Luke, in Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 36. And it came to pass about 8 days after these sayings, wait a minute, first thing right there. Matthew and Mark both said it was 6 days. Luke says 8 days. All right. Is that a contradiction? Well, you think about it a minute. Let's continue. It came to pass about 8 days after these sayings, he took Peter and John and James and went up into a mountain to pray. And as he prayed, the fashion of his countenance was altered, and his raiment was white and glistering. And behold, there talked with him 2 men, which was Moses and Elias, who appeared in glory and spoke of his decease, which he should accomplish at Jerusalem. But Peter and they that were with him were heavy with sleep. And when they were awake, they saw his glory, and the 2 men that stood with him. And it came to pass, as they departed from him, Peter said unto Jesus, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, and one for Elias, not knowing what he said. While he thus spoke, there came a cloud and overshadowed them, and they feared as they entered into the cloud. And there came a voice out of the cloud, saying, This is my beloved Son, hear him. And when the voice was past, Jesus was found alone. And they kept it close, and told no man in those days any of those things which they had seen. Going back to what Luke said there in verse 28, it was about 8 days after these sayings. Well, to know what he's talking about there, we've got to keep it in context. About 8 days after what sayings? Well, you back up. Just previously, we've had Jesus having a conversation and asking his disciples, Who do men say that I am? Well, you're John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the other prophets. Yes, but who do you say that I am? And then Peter acknowledging that, well, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then he has a conversation in which he's telling them he has to go to Jerusalem to have to suffer. And Peter's saying, "Oh no, Lord, don't say that. That's not going to happen." And Jesus turns to Peter and rebukes him. "Get behind me, Satan." And after these sayings, about 8 days later, well, why does Matthew and Mark say it was after 6 days? Well, day one doesn't count in the way that they're reckoning time. If you want to reckon time with the way the Jews did, it could begin with any portion of a day could be considered a full day. And so, if we're talking about the sayings taking place on day one, and then after 6 days, well, we got 1 day, and then after 6 days, that would be another day. So 1 plus 1 is 2 plus 6, that's 8. And so Matthew would say that it was about, or Luke would say, it was about 8 days after these sayings, whereas Matthew and Mark say after 6 days. They don't count the first day. They don't count the last day. They're only counting how many full days took place between those two things. I point that out just because the fact that sometimes those who are skeptics of the Bible, they would go to something like this and say, "How can you trust the Bible? Here's a contradiction. They're not even agreeing on how many days took place." Well, that's no contradiction. And just because you have a difference does not make a contradiction automatically. Sometimes the difference is just additional information. So we continue here. Matthew tells us in Matthew chapter 17, verse 2, that Jesus was transfigured. Mark tells us in chapter 9, verse 2, that Jesus was transfigured. Now, Luke doesn't use that word, but Luke says in Luke 9, verse 29, the fashion of his countenance was altered, and his raiment was white and glistering. Matthew in chapter 17, verse 2 said, his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. Mark said in Mark 9, verse 3, his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow, so as no fuller on earth can white them. What happened to Jesus? He was transfigured. All these that we have of descriptions of how his countenance changed, how he glowed, how his clothing was white as snow, that there was no way that the appearance of his clothing could be any whiter than it was. There could be no greater brightness. Well, why is it? He was transfigured. What does that mean? That means that his flesh was not obscuring his glory. The glory of God was being shown there in that human body. And the human body was not covering that glory. Moses and Elijah appear with him, and they're talking to Jesus. Now, here's something that I think is very important when we study this, is to ask the question, why Moses and Elijah? I mean, there are a lot of people that have lived and died, and there's a lot of heroes of faith that God could have chosen to come and appear and visit with Jesus. And we have to understand that God doesn't do anything just by happenstance. He didn't just say, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. He has picked Moses and Elijah for a purpose. Why did he pick Moses and Elijah? Well, what are they talking about? Well, you remember just a few days earlier when Jesus said, I've got to go to Jerusalem to suffer, to die. And Peter has tried to discourage him. Now Moses and Elijah show up. And Luke says, in Luke chapter 9, verse 31, and he's the only one that tells us what they're talking about. Matthew and Mark didn't tell us what the discussion is. Luke tells us that Moses and Elijah are speaking to Jesus of his decease, which he would accomplish at Jerusalem. Have you ever heard anybody talk about a decease, a death being an accomplishment? That's not normally how we talk about death. What a great accomplishment, he died. And yet that's exactly what's taking place here. They're talking to Jesus about his death and the accomplishment of his death. You see, when Jesus dies, something is going to be completed. And what is that? Well, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, Jesus had preached in his Sermon on the Mount, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets." Wait a minute, who's standing before him right now? Moses. Who is he? To the Jews, he's the one that gave them the law. I came not to destroy Moses, the law, or who? The prophets. Who's standing before him? Moses and who? Elijah. To the Jews, Elijah was the chief of the prophets. I did not come here to destroy the law or the prophets, but I came to fulfill them. You see, he came to complete them. What were they speaking to Jesus about? They were speaking about how his decease, his death, would accomplish something. It would complete something. In Colossians 2 verse 14, we know that old law ended when it was nailed to the cross with Jesus. So at Jesus' death, we have the accomplishment, we have the ending of the law and the prophets. It has been completed. Moses represents that law, Elijah represents the prophets, and then we've got Peter looking up. And Luke tells us in Luke 9 verse 32 that Peter, James, and John, they have fallen asleep and they are heavy with sleep. Everybody here has probably experienced being heavy with sleep. You know, just here, maybe right now, I don't know. Here just a couple of nights ago, we had an earthquake that was down in Arkansas, but we could feel it in Branson. And it was about 1:42 in the morning. The reason why I know is because the news says it was at 1:42, but also my wife was awake and I was asleep. I was heavy with sleep. And yet the house was rumbling and shaking a little. I could hear, in my sleep, I could hear some things clanking and moving around. And had she not said, "That's an earthquake," I'd have slept right through it and forgot it even happened, because I was heavy with sleep. But since she woke me up by saying that, it was just, what? And I was able to pull myself together and realize, yeah, that was, something did just happen. These apostles, these disciples at this time, as they're known as, they are heavy with sleep. And they look up and they see Jesus shining, Moses and Elijah. They're able to understand who they are. There's nothing said that any kind of introduction is given. Jesus saying, "I'd like for you to meet Moses and Elijah." No. They see Moses and Elijah. They know who they are. And Peter says, "Lord," now understand, we're told that they're about to leave. Obviously, based upon the demeanor or whatever words are being spoken, they're about to leave. And so Peter, he says, "Lord, let us make 3 tabernacles." Now, what's a tabernacle? Well, Numbers chapter 24, we learn that a tabernacle is nothing more than a tent. And that the Israelites, for many years, lived in tents. But we also know that a tabernacle was also something that was made, a great big tent that was made as a place of worship for the Israelites as they traveled in the wilderness. And it was a dwelling place of God. And so it was a place of worship of God. And so most likely, because of the fact that Peter says, okay, here's Moses, he gave us the law. Here's Elijah, he represents all the prophets, chief of the prophets. And then here's Jesus, the Son of God. We're in the presence of the who's who of the entire world. Let's make 3 tabernacles. One for you, Lord, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. What's he suggesting? He's suggesting that we need a place to worship each of them. Why did he say this? Well, Mark 9 verse 6. Mark tells us, "For he wist not what to say." Have you ever said anything that you shouldn't have said just because you didn't know what to say and you shouldn't have said anything, but you did? Well, why did he? Well, Mark tells us it's because they were all sore afraid. I mean, he wakes up, This is something that is supernatural that's going on. He sees the Lord there, and he doesn't want to be afraid, but he's in the presence of the Lord. But this is all so incredibly supernatural, and he's just still in this stupor of waking up. Okay, Lord, here's what... He should have just kept his mouth shut. But he was afraid. Luke 9, verse 33, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, one for Elias, not knowing what he had said. He's just talking to hear his head rattle, as some people would say. Not even knowing what it is that he's saying. Half asleep, maybe, but it seems like Peter just felt like somebody needed to say something. And it seems like he's suggesting, let's prepare 3 places of worship, one for each of you. At that point, we find a bright cloud comes over all of them. They're engulfed in this great cloud. In Luke 9, verse 34, we read, they feared as they entered the cloud. And then a voice from heaven spoke. Mark and Luke both say that the voice says, this is my beloved Son, hear him. Matthew says, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. Contradiction? No, just additional information. Matthew gives us a little bit more of the conversation. But the most important information is given by all 3 of them, in that Jesus is identified as who? The Son of God. This person, this is my beloved Son. Not Moses, not Elijah. Moses and Elijah had played a major role in the lives of the Jews. And in the past, God had said, hear them, because they're telling you what I want you to know. Listen to Moses. Listen to Elijah. Hear them. But that's the past. Things are changing. This is my beloved Son. Hear him. You know, the expression Son of God was never applied to Jesus until after he was born. 40 times in the New Testament, Son of God is mentioned in terms of referring to Jesus, but never before he was born of Mary. Jesus did not become God's Son until he became flesh. John 1, verses 1 through 4, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of man. So what does that tell us? In the beginning was the Word. What's the Word? Well, the Word was with God. The Word was God. There was not anything made that was not made by him. So who is this Word? Well, you drop down to John 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, who in heaven became flesh and dwelt among men? That would be Jesus. Before Jesus became Jesus, the Son of God, he was referred to as and known as the Word. Well, God says, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Matthew tells us that he's well pleased. Why is he pleased? Well, later, as I mentioned already in John chapter 12, when God speaks the 3rd time from heaven, when Jesus says, Father, glorify thy name, God says from that voice from heaven, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again, in referring to Jesus. This is encouragement to him because of what he's done and because what he will do by the completion of his death. I am well pleased. You have glorified me in your mission on earth, in your ministry, and you will continue to glorify me. He wasn't just pleased with Jesus, he was well pleased. And then, hear ye him. not Moses, not Elijah. Peter, not Moses, not Elijah. Now you know when the disciples heard this, Matthew chapter 17 verse 6 tells us that this voice speaking from heaven, you know, they've had their eyes open, they've been looking at Jesus, they've been looking at Moses, they've been looking at Elijah, and then they see this cloud coming over them, and so they're still looking around, and then there's the voice, "This is my..." Boom, they're on their face. Why did they suddenly fall to the ground? When all this going on, they were already afraid. They just thought they were afraid. When they heard the voice of God, and they knew it was the voice of God, "This is my beloved Son," as soon as they realized God in heaven was speaking, they're on their face on the ground. Why? Well, the power of God's voice in and of itself would be overwhelming to their body and soul. But something else that they would have understood as Jews, they'd have thought back to the time that Moses had said, "I'd like to see you." In Exodus chapter 33 and verse 20, and God said, "Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live." They knew that story. And so here you got God speaking. They've already seen things that are supernatural. They're seeing the glory of Jesus in the flesh. They're seeing two men that are heroes of faith from the past that are standing before them alive. And then there's the voice of God. They don't know what to expect next. They're on their face. They're scared to death. They're going to die. Because nobody can see the face of God and live. Matthew 17, verses 7 through 8. And Jesus came and touched them. You know, I find that very interesting because Jesus didn't have to touch them. He could have just said, "Come on, guys, get up. Time to go." But you see, Jesus was a man of compassion. There's a difference. There's an additional comfort level between someone saying something kind to you and someone actually extending a touch in that kindness. Jesus reached down and He's comforting them. He's assuring them they don't have to be afraid. Jesus touched them and said, "Arise, be not afraid." And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no man save Jesus alone. What happened? Jesus, Moses, Elijah. Well, here's what we ought to do. We ought to make these three tabernacles. "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Hear ye Him." They're on their face. They're afraid to look up. And then when they open their eyes, who's left? Only Jesus. Why? Because Moses and Elijah, that is now coming to an end with the death of Jesus. Hear the words of Jesus. The emphasis is on the authority of Jesus. Three great doctrines that are taught in this Transfiguration. Number one, the divinity of Jesus. Number two, the end of the Jewish covenant. And then number three, that there is a resurrection. Now this event must have left a great impression upon the disciples. Because as an old man, Peter would later write, 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. "For we have not followed cunningly devised fables, when we made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of His majesty. For He received from God the Father honor and glory, when there came such a voice to Him from the excellent glory, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And this voice which came from heaven we heard when we were with Him in the holy mount. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye Him." Brethren, that's still true today. John 14, verse 6, Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me." Well, how do we come to the Father? Well, Matthew 7, verse 21, Jesus said, "Not every one that saith unto me, Lord, Lord." Now, you can't come to the Father except through Jesus, but not everyone that says, "Lord, Lord," not everybody that recognizes Him as Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, who is that? That's going to be the ones that keep the will of the Father who's in heaven. John 12, verse 48, how is it that we know that we're doing the will of the Father? He that rejecteth me, Jesus said, and receiveth not my words, hath one that judgeth him. The word that I have spoken, the same shall judge him in the last day. Nobody comes to the Father except through Jesus. Nobody can come to the Father without doing the will of the Father. And the will of the Father is made known to us through the words of Jesus. Hear ye him. Thank you for your attention.